In 1918, the First World War came to a close with a decisive victory for the Entente. The next year, a series of settlements were forced upon the defeated Central Powers, the most famous of which was the Treaty of Versailles, which saw Germany stripped of its lands. 18 months earlier, Germany had imposed its own peace treaty on Russia, in which they took control of a vast swath of Eastern Europe. Yet, these treaties were products of the circumstances in which victory was achieved. For the Entente, it was after the war had become about self-determination, and was increasingly dominated by the United States. For Germany, it was only after Russia had begun to disintegrate as a coherent state. Neither the Entente nor the Central Powers got to ever truly fulfill their desired peace plans or their vision of a post-war world. This video, then, will look at the war aims of each of the 5 great powers that entered the First World War in 1914, how they changed, and how they imagined the post-war world. Germany. The first power we'll look at is Germany, the principal combatant. For the Central Powers, and arguably the nation with the most radical vision for restructuring the European order, German aims fluctuated throughout the conflict, often depending on who dominated the government at the time. Nevertheless, there were serious proposals on what concessions Germany desired from the war. The first of these is the most infamous September Program. Envisaged in 1914, when it seemed like Germany was on course for a quick victory. This was about as Carthaginian a peace as was imagined by any nation in the war. In the West, Germany was to annex resource-rich areas in France, such as the Brie region. Belgium was to be turned into a puppet state in control of the Channel ports so as to threaten Britain. Perhaps the most striking thing about this proposal is the remarkable similarity in the East to the land Germany actually took in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk almost 4 years later. It arguably reflects the fact that, for German diplomats, the main war was in the East, where the greatest spoils were to be had for Germany in terms of resource-rich land. Though Germany's war aims in Russia did always remain far more fluid than its demands in the West. Evidently, the September Program was never implemented, at least in the West. As Germany's armies were defeated at the Battle of the Marne, the subsequent descent into trench warfare meant German diplomats saw a favorable negotiated peace rather than total victory as the main aim of Germany's war effort. Instead, Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg took the often vague suggestions of the German Chancellor. Until 1917, Bethmann was no pacifist, but he was one of the more lucid German policymakers, and understood Germany would have to compromise in some aspects. He never offered a set series of proposals, but regarding Western Europe, he envisaged small border corrections, with the annexation of Brie and Luxembourg. The terms discussed with the Belgian king in a proposed separate peace in 1916 included the demilitarization of Belgium and economic dependence on Germany. In the East, his dreams weren't as expansionist as outlined in the September Program, but still aimed for Poland and Lithuania to be declared as independent states. Even so, he did at various points ponder a separate, lenient peace with Russia so as to focus on the West. Bethmann was ultimately ousted in 1917, so never got to seriously attempt to negotiate a negotiated settlement. Next, there was a plan advocated by German Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, who had been instrumental in the creation of Germany's high seas fleet prior to the war. Tirpitz never really got near the levers of diplomatic power, but his plans are interesting for how completely delusional they are. Tirpitz saw the war as a struggle for world rather than European supremacy. Thus, he believed, the British Empire and its command of the sea lanes was the main enemy to defeat Britain. He advocated signing a white peace with Russia in the East and focusing on the Western Front, annexing the Channel ports to prepare for the next war, which would be a final clash against Britain. Finally, there was the plan of the Third Ohl, dominated by Hindenburg and Ludendorff, in case of victory in 1918. This was after peace had been made with Russia in the March of that year. Ludendorff saw Russia's defeat only as a preliminary to total victory in the West. In reality, though, there were never any concrete proposals. But we can assume it would have been similar to the September program. Almost all of these plans came attached with the proposal for a German-led economic union with the rest of Europe that would provide a market for German goods and exclude Britain, generally known as Middle Europa, based on a book written in 1915. Though it wasn't actually an authoritative policy statement. The common theme here is that this was not a war of survival for Germany. Even supposed compromised pieces aimed to ensure Germany was supreme on the continent for the foreseeable future. In the end, this refusal to compromise meant Germany ended up being completely defeated in 1918, with even Brest-Litovsk being annulled by the Entente. France. Of all the combatants in the First World War, France had the single clearest war aim, the reclamation of Alsace-Lorraine. The territory had been amputated from France in 1871 after the Franco-Prussian War, and the desire to reclaim the territory had stimulated revanchist sentiment in the country since. The territory was so vital that, despite the fact German armies sat deep inside French territory for most of the war, French diplomats almost totally refused to contemplate any negotiated peace that didn't include Alsace. France was also motivated more than any nation by hostility to Germany, which had replaced France as Europe's preeminent power in 1871. Consequently, French war aims were also shaped around finding ways of limiting German power. These ranged from the most hardline stances that Germany should be Vulcanized to the comparatively moderate position that the imbalance between Germany and France should be redressed. One way this could be done was by annexing more German territory. The French, for much of the war, maintained designs on the coal-heavy region of the Saarland, which would be annexed to increase France's industrial strength. More extensive plans advocated the setting up of a rump Rhinish state to provide security for France. Whilst in the early days of the war, the French military even considered recreating France's natural borders by annexing all of the left bank of the Rhine. There are other more minor colonial claims, particularly affecting Syria. But ultimately, French war aims were almost solely focused on weakening Germany and strengthening France in the European balance of power. In the end, France would reclaim Alsace-Lorraine, but would have to settle for a demilitarized Rhineland and the separation of the Saarland as a League of Nations mandate, eventually to be annexed back into Germany. Russia. Russia was a nation that was in an almost perpetual crisis of self-confidence over what the war was actually being fought for. The initial casus belli had been defending the Slavic brother state Serbia from annihilation, but as the body count began stacking up, this wasn't a particularly sellable point to the Russian public. When Russia went to war, the Supreme Commander Nikolai Nikolaevich published a manifesto promising the creation of a Polish state within the Russian Empire. The aim was to do this by joining Congress Poland with German and Austrian Polish regions. This would serve the more general Russian aim of weakening Germany and destroying Austria as a competitor in the Balkans. The Russians never went as far, though, as to specify the complete destruction of the Habsburgs, for fear that the collapse of this multi-ethnic empire would encourage the Russians' own minorities to rebel. Despite these territorial aims, there was a degree of Germanophilia running throughout the Russian elite, who saw the conflict less as a clash between nation-states and more as a clash between the liberal West and the autocratic East that Russia just happened to be on the wrong side of. This view was silenced by the entry of Russia's perennial foe, the Ottoman Empire, into the war. The foreign minister Sazonov was able to extract a commitment from Britain and France that Russia would take Constantinople at the end of the war, formerly the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, which Russia claimed to be a successor of. The city would also finally give Russia access to the Mediterranean. after the war became an almost holy endeavor against the Muslim Turks. A separate peace with Germany was never seriously discussed, and Russia remained committed to the war effort until the Bolshevik Revolution. The overthrow of the Tsar in the February Revolution did change Russia's war aims, but I won't go into them here. In sum, then, Russian war aims look something like this.